Dober večer, lep pozdrav. So today with me it's Sir Charles A. Coulombe again. He was already my guest, and we had such a good talk. I had to invite him again. Before we start, sir, we'll do a short prayer to our Holy Mother to bless us with good and wise words. Yes.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
Sancti.
Amen.
Amen.
Memorare, o
Orae
purissima Virgo
obisque
Maria,
Virgo Maria,
non esse
non
auditum
esse
a
auditum a
seculo,
seculo,
quemquam ad tua
quemquam ad tua
curentem
currentem
presidia,
presidia,
tua
tua
implorantem auxilia,
implorantem auxilia,
tua petentem
tua pendem
suffragia,
suffragia,
esse
esse
derelictum,
delictum.
ego tali
Ego tali
animatus
animatus
confidentia,
confidentia,
ad te,
a
Virgo
te,
Virginum,
Virgum,
Mater,
mater
curo, ad te
curo
venio,
advenio,
coram te gemens,
coram te
peccator
gemens,
assisto,
assisto,
noli mater
noli mater
verbi,
verbi,
verba mea
verbo me
despicere,
despicere,
sed
sed
audi
audi
propitia
propitia
et
exaudi.
exaudi.
Amen.
Amen. Gloria Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
Spiritus Sancto, sicut erat in principio, et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
Well, thank you, sir, for that.
Sure,
Now we
sure.
can start talking with full strength. Greetings again. How are
Well,
you,
thank
sir?
you. Great to be back. I hope to be there physically sooner rather than later, because Slovenia is a country I've literally been through
Yeah.
on my way to Croatia.
Okay. So
And
you're getting to our former empire.
yep.
Okay.
And I'm actually very excited, because speaking of your former empire, the Mariensäule, the Mary Column in Prague,
Hmm?
has been rebuilt.
Oh yeah, I saw your enthusiastic posts on Facebook, and I was very delighted to see that. And I think in Slovenia we're still waiting for something like that to happen, because we tend to, think of ourselves as a Marian nation, but I think for about 40 years or something, it kind of just like quiet everything. So I hope we bring that up again. But today we decided to talk about what actually took away our empire from us, and especially to talk about our last emperor, Blessed Karl. As we talked before, I'm still under great impression from this documentary I saw on YouTube, and I was discussing about it with my wife and Karl when we drove yesterday. Thank God the borders opened. Did you know
Yeah.
that? So we had again the privilege to go to Klagenfurt to traditional Latin mass that we go every Sunday. And on the way there, we talked about it. And I was like, Petra, that's her name. I said, Petra, are you aware that our last sovereign, our last emperor that we had, is a saint? He's blessed. He's blessed Karl. Isn't that amazing?
Well, what's kind of embarrassing about it for the American is that, of course, our president was largely responsible for this saint being pushed off his throne.
Mm,
And,
mhm,
you
mhm.
know, it's a very uncomfortable feeling,
Oh yeah.
because it's a very uncomfortable feeling because the more you delve into who he was and what he did, um, the worse you feel about the role your country played. Not your country, my country.
Yeah.
I'm speaking in the abstract.
Mm.
But the worse you feel about the role one's country played in that war. Um, I was privileged. I was mentioning it to you, but before the show, I was privileged to present a wreath at the tomb of Field Marshal Boreyevich, who was the last general to keep up arms for the emperor at the end of the war. Laid a wreath on his grave in Vienna, and they asked me to say a few words, and I had to say that while it was a privilege and an honor, it was also very humbling, because of the unfortunate role my country played in that war, certainly as far as Austria-Hungary was concerned.
Mm.
Uh, one of the interesting things about the war was that we declared war on Austria months after we declared war on Germany. And there is kind of an interesting, if sad, story about how it came to pass, because Germany, Mr. Wilson was very keen on getting into the war. And one of the reasons that he adduced was the unconditional submarine warfare.
Yeah, but if I may interrupt, the
Of
the
course,
the general population were not so keen on going to war abroad,
no,
because
not at all.
the isolationism in the United States at that time was pretty much the same as it is today, if not even more.
It was much more so. You've got to remember that there were a lot of German Americans,
Yeah, and
and
he
they,
made a promise to them.
yeah, and they were not keen on going to war against Germany. There were a lot of Irish Americans who were not keen on going to war for Britain. So
Okay.
between them, the Irish and the Germans, who, interestingly enough, in internal Catholic Church politics in America, had been at loggerheads during the 19th century and the early 20th. When the question of the war came up, they were completely united.
Mm-hmm.
They were not keen on going to war. The Italians were divided, and the French Canadian Catholics in America were not keen on the war either. So, and there were others. Lutherans weren't in favor of it, and so forth. But two things occurred. One was the unconditional submarine warfare against shipping,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which Kaiser Karl told the Germans was a stupid idea because it would bring the Americans into the war. And he said, if you bring the Americans into the war, we are not going to win. Well, as was so often the case, they thought they knew better, and they didn't. So, but the casus belli, the reason for the war, the stated reason for the war with Germany, was the so-called Zimmermann telegram, which purported to be a telegram from the German Foreign Office in Berlin to their ambassador in Mexico, which supposedly told their ambassador in Mexico to promise the Mexican government the American Southwest if they would go to
Texas
war with the United
and I
States.
don't know,
Hmm?
Texas and a few more states.
Yeah. Now, the problem with that was that Mexico was in the middle of a civil war at the time and was not going to be going to war with anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Now, either this represented a colossal stupidity on the part of the German Foreign Office, which is kind of hard to credit, or it was a forgery of some kind. But whatever the case, that was what was used to get us into the war with Germany. Now, Austria, we did not declare war on initially. But what happened, and the reason why the United States did declare war on Austria, I think in October of 1917, was that the Italian front collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
And so Woodrow Wilson was very keen on rushing American troops to the Italian front to shore up Italy. But the problem with that was that we were neutral in that war between Austria and Italy. And as a rule, you really can't go shoring up a collapsing front in a war which you're not really a part of. You can't do that. So we declared war on Austria. But the interesting thing was that the casus belli there was that a ship on which some American passengers were was torpedoed
Mm-hmm.
by a U-boat. And it was claimed that this was an Austrian U-boat.
Ah.
So during the debate on the thing in Congress, one of the survivors was asked, "Well, how do you know it was Austrian?" And his response was, "Well, they were speaking Austrian."
Oh, Americans.
So,
with
okay.
all the respect, but
Listen, I don't know a single Austrian who's come to the United States and hasn't been asked about kangaroos. So, it's okay. It's all right. I understand. Don't worry about it. You're not hurting my feelings.
well, Vienna has a very beautiful zoo, so Maybe.
Well, I have an Austrian friend who's kind of a joker. In fact, all my Austrian friends are jokers. Anyway, point is, whenever he would get asked about kangaroos and in the States, he'd always say, "Oh yes, up and down the Ringstrasse, you can barely park because they're always jumping up and down. It's horrible."
Yeah.
And they were, "Oh wow, that must really be something." Well, you know that New Year's broadcast from Vienna, from the Musikverein.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's very difficult to get in because of the kangaroos. They're attracted by the music. Oh, I had no idea. Oh. So, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. It cracks me up too. So don't worry about it. But seriously, though, that was what got us into the war with Austria-Hungary. Now, pulling back for a minute and focusing for a second on Kaiser Karl himself,
Hmm.
he was a tragic figure in a number of ways, not least of which, and this is something, incidentally, he shares with the Stuart claimant to the British throne, Bonnie Prince Charlie, who, very famous thing in British history, he attempted to retake the throne of his fathers in 1745 and 6. It's a big thing in British history. But he was like Kaiser Karl in the sense that both were young men, both were not that experienced and not that trained, and yet both had an instinct, uh, an intuition about the ways things should be done
Hmm.
that was better than their far more experienced lieutenants, who very often would overrule them, which was not their right. In the case of Bonnie Prince Charlie, when they went all the way down to Derby in England, uh, England did not rise for the Stuart cause, and so his Scottish generals said, "We better go back to Scotland." He said, "No, I'm telling you, we go to Oxford and then we go to London and we do it quickly and we'll win." And they said, "Oh, no, no, no." And they picked up this double agent who assured them that there was another army floating around somewhere, and there wasn't. But again, as had happened during several battles prior to this, the prince knew. How he knew, who knows, but it was his instinct. We go now, we win. Well, as it turns out, George II was already packing at the news they'd gotten to Derby, because he was, why wouldn't they stop? There was nothing between them and London. He was absolutely sure the game was up. So similarly, in Kaiser Karl's life, time and again, he knew what should have been done,
Mm-hmm.
but he would be overruled by his lieutenants. This was true in foreign affairs. It was true in military affairs. It was, and also his allies better, Hindenburg and Ludendorff. So he knew that gas was a bad idea. Oh, no, 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 this will win the war. Unconditional submarine warfare is a bad idea. No, 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 this will win the war. Sending Lenin to Russia is a bad idea. No, 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 this will win the war. And the problem was that he was not in a position to assert himself, because he came to the war. Not only was he came to the throne, rather, not only was he a young man, but it was a war that he hadn't started. He was not taken seriously by people who should have taken him seriously, who had shall we say, an oath to take him seriously. And yet, time and again, he showed that had he been followed, had they done what he told them, things would have turned out very differently.
If we put things in some context, so where was Blessed Karl when the war started? What was he doing at that time?
He was in the
So
army.
we know he was coronated in 1917?
1916, December of 1916.
1916. Okay, sorry. Yeah. So that was 2 years after the war started.
Right.
And before he was in the military.
He was in the military, and it's important to remember that he was the heir to the heir.
Oh yeah. Well, Obviously.
Yeah, and that he was in a peculiar position. When he was born, it was very unlikely that he would ever be emperor. And the reason for this was that Franz Josef had a son living, Crown Prince Rudolf,
Yeah.
and he had a brother who was Karl's grandfather. That brother had two sons, Franz Ferdinand and Otto, Otto being Karl's father. And Franz Ferdinand was not married at the time, but surely he would get married. So, and of course he did, but morganatically. So it looked as though it was very, very unlikely that Karl would ever assume the throne. But of course, as we know, Rudolf died mysteriously at Mayerling. Franz Ferdinand married morganatically, so that is to say, he married beneath the station,
Mm-hmm.
so that his children could not inherit the throne. And then Karl's father, Otto, died young, died early. And that meant that there was his great uncle, Franz Josef, his uncle, Franz Ferdinand, and then him. Now, kind of an interesting note here about Karl and about his relationship with these two older men. The last day that I was writing my book, I was hit by a thought which I'd not seen anywhere else. It hit me literally as I was just about closing it up. He's seen today, Karl is, as a patron for rulers, as a patron for soldiers, because he was good at both. He's seen as a patron for husbands and fathers for the same reason. But it struck me also that he is a very good patron for the children of broken homes and difficult families, because his parents were terribly ill-suited for each other. Archduke Otto the elder, not the younger, who was Karl's son,
Yeah.
but the older, he was a very pleasant fellow, very good-looking, a lot of fun, very dissolute, very immoral. And in fact, he died of syphilis. His mother, the Archduchess Maria Josefa, was a Saxon princess, the daughter of the King of Saxony. Very devout, very pious, very dull, very dur, as we say in English.
Mm.
Well, even though they did not get on very well, Karl loved them both very much and got on very well with both of them. Beyond that, he took the best from each of them. From his father, he got his very easy manner, his humor, his charm, his, that sort of thing, but not his promiscuity.
Thankfully.
And from his mother, he got that very deep piety that she had and that
Mm-hmm.
sense of purpose, but not the dullness, not the dourness. He took the best from both, which is really what you want from a child in that position. What you want for them is to get the best from either.
Oh.
And but this, I should say that this skill stood him in good stead, because his two male elders, Franz Josef and Franz Ferdinand, had problems with each other. Franz Ferdinand, having married morganatically, really annoyed Franz Josef. That was the first problem. The second problem was that Franz Josef, having gone through all sorts of problems to bring about the Ausgleich, was fine with the constitutional arrangements as they were and didn't want any changes. He was also, again, the end of a long life, he was happy with the German alliance and didn't want to change anything. Franz Ferdinand, on the other hand, very, very different kettle of fish. He wanted to federalize the Austrian Empire, Austria and Hungary.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've got to make a point here. A lot of people are under the misapprehension that Franz Ferdinand was anti-Magyar. That is not true, not in the slightest. In fact, the priest who was closest to him, Father Lanyi, was a Magyar, taught him to speak Hungarian. He had a lot of friends in Hungary, a lot of political allies. He was against the Tisas. He was against Hungarian liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
That is true. Just as he was against the pan-Germanism in Austria. And that's important to bear in mind, because wanting some kind of a decent shake for the Slovaks and the Romanians and the Croats and so forth was not the same as hating the Magyars. It's a very, very important distinction. People don't realize it, they forget it, but it's got to be brought out.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so he was searching for some way that all of this could be accommodated. And this is something, too, you've got to bear in mind, not just with him, but also with Franz Josef, how the nationality problem was a constant issue for them. And they always had to try to deal with it. There was no way to fix it. It just, how do you get these peoples not to hate each other? And that we'll come back to with Karl, but it was an important problem. And it was one that really bedeviled Franz Ferdinand, and he was constantly searching for ways to deal with it. The other thing with Franz Ferdinand was that he was not happy with the German alliance. The truth is that he would have preferred, I mean, he wasn't anti-German per se, any more than he was anti-Magyar. But he was very much aware of the fact that Austria stood a terrible chance of becoming a mere satellite of Germany.
Yeah, and if I may just jump in,
Now,
there
please
were
feel
there
free
were
whenever
yeah.
you want to jump in, or I'll just keep babbling. Don't just jump in.
Well, there were some major differences, as I'm starting to observe now, between the Austrian Empire, the people of the Austrian Empire, and the Prussians. The
Oh,
Prussians are completely different folks than people living inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
yeah, they're very different. And to be honest with you, even 100 years later, Romanians, Poles, Ukrainians, Serbs living in Poland, Romania, Ukraine, Serbia, etc., that were in the areas that were part of the old empire are very different from their countrymen on the other side of the old border. And
Mm-hmm.
you see this reflected in voting patterns. You see it reflected in attitudes toward government. You see it in levels of corruption. You see it in all sorts of things. The so-called Habsburg effect is still very, very much there.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
what the unfortunate role that nationalism played, and I say unfortunate because it was a good role too. I mean, personally, I think a revival of the languages, the folklore, and the cultures and so forth of the various peoples of the empire was a great thing. You know, the so-called romantic nationalism had its good side as well as its downside. But the downside was it obscured the commonalities between the different peoples of the empire.
Mm-hmm.
And that commonality, to a great degree, remains to this day.
Oh yeah, and when I wanted to talk about the rising nationalisms that they did a lot of damage to Austrian Empire, and I think they were kind of artificially, you know, like.
Well, they were whipped up, and the thing too is that 2020 hindsight is an old saying in the United States. You can look backwards with complete clarity, and
Mm,
looking backwards that way, we can see that in tearing apart the empire, the peoples of the empire did themselves no good at all. Uh,
exactly. Yeah.
there was when I was young, there was a Czech restaurant in Hollywood, which was quite old, called the Little Prague, and it was presided over by an old Czech lady, oddly enough, who was a refugee of some kind. But I first went to the place when I was 15 or 16, and I saw a big painting of Franz Josef on the wall. And I saw
Awesome.
that.
That's
Well,
awesome.
it was, but I looked at it and I said to the lady, I said, ma'am, I thought you Czechs were supposed to hate the Habsburgs. And she said, well, we did, but we've been through a number of alternatives since then, and none of them have really worked out very well.
Yeah.
And I think all the peoples of the empire could say that. None of the alternatives have worked out very well since then. Uh,
Exactly.
you don't know what you've got till you lose it is another American phrase. But the point too then with Franz Ferdinand is that he was very keen on forging new alliances with Britain, with Russia,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even with France, depending on how that would go. One of the interesting things I discovered just by chance, I had no idea when I was doing my research for the book, it shows you the wonders of the internet. Just for giggles, I looked up Franz Ferdinand gifts perish. Looking, as I hoped, to find out things he had donated to different churches in the empire. Because, for
Mm.
instance, he actually was behind the great Marian shrine, or not Marian, the Shrine of the Sacred Heart in Hall in Tyrol. He endowed it. It had been turned into a barracks under Joseph II. He
Hmm.
bought it and turned it back into a shrine of the Sacred Heart, and he died before it could be dedicated. And it was interesting, when he died, he had a medal of the Sacred Heart on him. He was very devout. People don't know that about Franz Ferdinand. They knew he was a great hunter, but they don't know that he was a very, very devout individual. Anyway, so the thing is that in looking this up, I found that he had visited a church in England. He and his wife, Sophie, had visited this English parish church somewhere in the Midlands in 1912 or 1913. I forget the exact date, it's in the book. But I thought this was peculiar. What brought them there? So this led me into searching it out. Well, it turns out he had gone to a hunting party at the great estate of a British nobleman, and present were all the leaders of the British Tory party who were out of power at that time. And I thought to myself, now that's interesting. Here's Franz Ferdinand at a hunting party with all of the major conservative leaders in 1913 or 1912. Now, he was not above sort of carrying on his own quasi-foreign policy. So it occurred to me, in reading this and reading between the lines, other things I learned about him, that in all likelihood, had he become emperor, whenever there was a Tory party in power again in Britain, he would no doubt have sought to come to an alliance with Britain, or at least an understanding. And
Well,
this,
yeah. At least maybe he would be kind of persuaded not to go into coalition with Prussians.
well, quite likely, because I mean, he had a view, you see, and this is what people forget about the House of Habsburg. They had a very European view. Uh, it was a combination of reasons. I mean, part of it having ruled most of Europe at different times, but they were also the antithesis of nationalists. There was a famous story of I guess it was Kaiser Franz, the first Austrian emperor, last Holy Roman Emperor. He was told that some partisan fighter somewhere against Napoleon was very loyal, was very, very patriotic. And his response was, well, yes, but is he a patriot for me? And this was the dilemma that the Habsburgs dealt with. One of the interesting things, again, in reading a lot of the correspondence from different leaders of nationalities to successive emperors, is how, and I'm sorry to have to say this way, is how childish some of them were in terms of talking about the other nationalities. And it was reciprocal. I don't mean to single any of them out. You would see the same stuff. Well, look, those guys over there. And I thought, my God, if I were on the receiving end of a letter like this, I'd tear my hair out. Maybe that's my
I'd
friends.
start a war as well.
Yeah, just to shut everybody up.
And
But
usually, sorry to interrupt. And usually, it looks like that when again when we were discussing, when I tried to explain to my wife, um, probably she heard before that, but again, how it all started. I was telling her how the conflict started, the killing of Franz Ferdinand and stuff like that, and then the war between Prussia and Russia out of nowhere, and then France comes, and then the Brits come, and then Austrian Empire, and then everyone's killing each other, and they actually, in reality, don't know why.
not really. And the sad thing, what makes it even sadder, is that again, you read the correspondence at the time of the sovereigns with each other, and by the sovereigns in this case, I mean the Kaiser, the Tsar, and
Hmm.
Franz Joseph. You realize that they no longer really control the machinery of government.
Yeah, yeah.
Not in any of those three
It
countries.
was all in hands of generals, and
Generals, civil servants, and the electorate. You
mm.
can't see. This is one thing people love to do, is to leave out the role democracy played in the First World War.
Oh,
And my brother, of all people, gave me an insight into the declaration, which I don't mind sharing, and it's this. If you look at the demands that Austria made of Serbia, they're really not very radical. Not when you consider, A, that Franz Ferdinand was murdered by an organization with ties to the Serbian Secret Service, and that the Serbian government knew it. Now, how do we know this? We know this because they knew, I cannot remember the man's name, but Apis was his code name. So you Google Serbian Secret Service and Apis, and you'll get him.
Mm-hmm.
The Serbs executed the man themselves in 1916. So it's not like they didn't know what the story was. And mind you, I'm not saying the Serbian government per se was behind the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Not at all. But this fellow did and was. Mind you, he was the man who engineered the murder of the Serbian king and queen in 1903.
Mm-hmm.
He had tried to go for Franz Josef on another occasion. That failed. So he made a play for Franz Ferdinand. That worked. So Austria-Hungary's demands were really not very radical at all. So the question is, why did the Serbs dig in their heels? Well, the reason is because the Serbian government faced elections in November, and they could not afford to look weak in the face of Austria-Hungary. Not in an election year. And the funny thing is, when various telegrams and ultimata and all that went back and forth between Vienna and Belgrade, what you find is that the prime minister had to come back quickly to Belgrade because he was on the election route.
Yeah, like campaigning.
He was
Yeah.
campaigning.
Yeah.
Now, so my brother tells me this very triumphantly, and he says, so you could call World War I yet another triumph for democracy.
Yeah, triumph. And it's really interesting now that you say, it can kind of hit me in the head when I was watching this documentary that France had a prime minister, they had a democracy, and when I look for the first time, what was the role of France, and we're still before the war starts. It's the French really didn't do any good because they were talking to Kaiser Wilhelm for a few times. Then they went to Russia. The prime minister was a social democrat. That tells you a lot. So they really kind of stirred the pot there.
See, France, you've got to bear in mind, had a gaping wound, and that gaping wound was Alsace-Lorraine.
Yeah, well.
And interestingly enough, Emperor Charles had visited Alsace-Lorraine. And bear in mind, of course, the Habsburgs are Habsburg-Lorraine.
Yeah.
That's why when Archduke Otto got married there in 1940 or 1951, was it 50, whenever it was, the mobs in Nancy, the city in Lorraine where he and his wife were married, cheered "Vive le Duc, Vive le Duc," because he was, after all, the rightful Duke of Lorraine. But at any rate, the thing is that, and that again is also one reason why they were very westward looking. So with all of this being borne in mind, the French were keen on getting Alsace-Lorraine back, and this had been the case ever since the Franco-Prussian War. I mean, it's fair to say that World War I worked out in the way it did because of two major previous occurrences. Now, there were other things, of course, but the one, this is going to sound very arcane and strange, but I believe it to be true. The one was Austria's failure to come to Russia's aid in the Crimean War in 1853. Now, why was that a problem? Well, the problem was that in 1848, the Russians had helped Franz Josef suppress the Hungarian Revolution, as did the subject peoples of the Hungarians. The Slovaks, the Romanians, the Serbs, the Croats, they all fought for the Kaiser against Kossuth. Again, this is forgotten today. But like you go to Slovakia, the uniforms of the Slovene Presidential Guard in Bratislava are based on the militia red uniforms during 1848. But so they're suppressed. But 1853 comes along, Russia gets into war with Britain and France, and Sardinia would go in to be able to demand favors out of Britain and France later. And instead of aiding Russia, Franz Joseph is neutral. So the Russians feel betrayed. And what does that mean? It means that in 1859, when France declares war on Austria, and in 1866, when Prussia declares war on Austria, Austria has no allies. Had she had Russia as an ally, both Prussia and France would have thought very differently about what they did. Instead, they didn't. Austria is pushed out of both Italy and Germany, and now what? So that was the first thing. The second problem was, of course, Bismarck. The way in which the German Empire was constructed and the seizure of Alsace-Lorraine, all of that really helped set the stage for another war. But there were other contributing factors. One of them being that nobody had any idea really of what modern warfare was like. They were thinking of the Napoleonic Wars or the Crimea. They were thinking of beautiful uniforms and the banners in the sunset and so forth. Had they paid attention to our American Civil War, they would have figured out what trench warfare was going to be like, because we had it.
You had it?
Oh yes, Siege of Petersburg. We had trenches. We had all the miserable things that happened on the Western Front.
Because I guess when people think of American Civil War, is still the soldiers marching in lines towards each other.
They did. They did, and it was very bloody because of it.
Not in the context of modern warfare, like tactics.
Well, see, that's the thing. We didn't have trenches everywhere, but we did have them, and where we had them, they were just like in World War I, only more primitive. Similarly, we had Gatling guns instead of machine guns. We had aerial bombardments. We had submarines. None of them nearly as perfected as they would be in 50 years. But had they wanted to approximate what modern warfare would like, they really should have studied our Civil War and then added 50 years to the technology. Because, of course, that kind of horror was still in its infancy in our Civil War. It was bad. And again, people today forget that war was our bloodiest war ever. More Americans died in it than all the other wars we've fought combined. It was horrible. And I have to say, you've heard me giggle a little bit at my country earlier tonight. But one of our greatest accomplishments, which unfortunately I'm seeing torn to shreds in front of my very eyes now, was the healing of the wounds of that horrible war in such a relatively quick time. 50 years after the Battle of Gettysburg in 1913, they had a reunion. They had all these old Confederate veterans relive Pickett's charge running down the hill. And there were the old Union veterans who had been there that day waiting for them, literally with open arms. And they threw their arms around them. I mean, America in 1913 was not what you would call a very huggy place.
Yeah. Was it Gettysburg that President Lincoln had a famous speech?
Yes.
After the battle, I was talking. I had one a Slovenian host, a very prominent economist living in London, and we were discussing our civil war in Slovenia, and he said we should look at Gettysburg when in the middle of the war. It was, I think, right in the middle.
Yep. 1863.
63. The President Lincoln had a speech that was looking in the future, like how the reconciliation could be made and stuff like that in the middle of war. Whereas in Slovenia, after 75 years, almost 80 years, we still cannot heal our wounds from civil war.
And that's my point. And it's not just Slovenia. That is the norm for most civil wars. They remain a festering wound for decades and decades and decades, because civil wars engender the kind of hatred and horror that normal wars rarely do. But in our case, we got through it pretty quickly. And unfortunately today, as I see the Confederate monuments being pulled down,
Yeah.
People are intent on ripping those wounds open again.
Yeah, I wanted to open that discussion, but I quickly said to myself, let's stick with Blessed Karl for today, and
No,
we
I'm
can.
I'm I'm quite I'm quite happy to
I,
do so, but
yeah.
I mention it simply because you know firsthand how difficult it is to reacquire that kind of unity and that kind of reconciliation. And yet it is so important
Yeah.
because you can't really live a healthy national life
No, it's
without
crippling. It's crippling. It's
absolutely crippling. Well, I mean, it's like literally it's like being a cripple with big suppurating wounds in your legs.
yeah. Or I would say like having a tumor on your lungs.
Yeah,
You cannot breathe with
you
full
can't breathe.
lungs. Yeah.
And what a big, I mean, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I think, and again, you'll take this as the observation of a sympathetic outsider.
Hmm.
You know, I've always loved Central Europe. My mother, of course, was very much a lover of the Habsburgs. But I really come to love this part of the world, and not just for historical reasons, also for very present day reasons. I mean, one thing that has to be understood, I think, especially by Central Europeans, is that Western Europe and the United States have gone off on a comet. We've gone off to Fantasyland. Uh, the whole gender thing, abortion, all of our various corruptions and perversions. Um, it's what we've come to define ourselves by, which is horrific. Not just because they're wrong and evil in themselves, although they are. They're also not self-sustaining. We
Yeah.
can't last like this.
Well, you know, E. Michael Jones says Americanism.
Yeah. Well, Americanism has two separate but somewhat connected definitions. There is the specific heresy, the Catholic heresy of Americanism, which is the idea that the Catholic Church in America, because you're so wonderful and democratic and free and tremendous and stuff, should be unlike that in the rest of the world and do its own thing. And also, what we call the contemplative virtues are less important than the active ones.
Hmm.
So it's more important, in other words, to feed the hungry than to pray.
Yeah.
Now, that's Americanism. But then there's also Americanism in the sense of the civic religion of the country, in
Mm.
which we deify the founding fathers, the flag and the Liberty Bell and the Constitution as sacred, the Constitution having been brought by the Holy Ghost
Yeah.
directly to the founding fathers at Philadelphia. The founding fathers themselves are like the 12 apostles. Washington is sort of a Christ figure. So is
Yeah.
Lincoln.
That's why I was so careful when talking to you the last time, when I was asking what would be the possibility of United States becoming a monarchy, because I know that's nowhere near your holy constitution.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I wrote a book about that very
Yeah,
topic,
yeah, I know.
sort of a novel,
Yeah, we discussed
and I
it.
explored, yeah, I explored those issues. Um, Unfortunately, what was the making of us? This is so often the case in human history and in human lives. What was so often the making of us may very well be the breaking of us. That is to say, the very principles that allowed us to grow and become a very powerful nation may very well be what is killing us now. And I mention all this because Central Europe has a chance to escape our fate. I mean, if you remember A Christmas Carol, you know, Charles Dickens' story of Ebenezer Scrooge.
Yeah,
Uh, in the beginning, Jacob Marley, the ghost of his dead partner, who's condemned to walk the earth for 7 years, basically a purgatory, because he was such a miser. He says, Ebenezer, you have yet a chance and a hope of escaping my fate. Well, I sit here before you now as Jacob Marley to Central Europe's Ebenezer Scrooge.
well,
And I tell you, you have yet a chance and a hope of escaping our fate.
I think not enough people is listening. But you know, on the other hand, I think we're just starting to go into the same vice as United States is slowly coming out of. the gender theory is just coming to Europe, whereas I think in United States is slowly starting to die
I
off.
wouldn't I wouldn't go that far. I mean,
You
right
think
now
it hasn't reached peak degeneracy yet?
no, I don't think so.
But
Because
when I see I'm sorry to interrupt, but when I see the photos of those degenerates with horns and stuff like that, reading LGBTQP novels in public libraries to children, I
yeah,
think
that hasn't ended yet. In
it
fact,
that's not peak.
no. I mean,
God help us.
you've got to bear in mind that what the country is going through right now. I mean, America is divided in two. Well, more than two, but two vague entities, shall we say. And the dominant one in terms of our media and much of the government is this stuff. I mean, and even under President Trump, everyone's jumping up and down about how wonderful he is. Well, he still proclaimed Gay Pride Month. If you go to the National Park Service's website, which, by the way, I recommend highly, if you really want to get to know some of the best things about the United States, go to the National Park Service's website. They've got all sorts of great stuff. But they have a section on called "Telling American Stories," which is about the histories demonstrated through various sites around the country, the histories of the major building blocks of our peoples. So
Hmm.
you have the American Indians, the Europeans, the blacks, the Asians, etc. All great stuff and really informative. But ever since 2016, added under President Obama, you've got a section for LGBTQ, ML, XL5, etc., as though it was a separate ethnic group. And that has been the same under Trump as under Obama. Uh, it's the way it is. Now, I repeat, you have yet a chance and a hope of escaping our fate. But to do it, you are going to have to reach back into your own traditions.
Yeah, if we kind of connect the bridge here, maybe President Trump needs more Jesus and obviously more Blessed Karl.
Yeah, I would say.
Now
And
I
of
think
course,
Melania is doing some part on Jesus thing, but the Blessed Karl part is now on.
not on the screen, but let's hope that the centennial year can become a way of showing the world about Kaiser Karl,
Yeah.
2022. The thing is that, and we haven't forgotten Kaiser Karl. I do have a point with all of this. As I say, though, to defeat that, whatever it is we have, our degeneracy, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
Central Europe really has to pull together. It really must. There is no room, not just for in your internal divisions, but for your external ones as well. And I don't mean you've got to unite into one single country. That's not my point. But you've got to accept your commonalities that is so good.
Do you have an opinion on Visegrad
Yeah, yeah,
countries
yeah.
or the
Sure. I
Union
mean,
Visegrad Union? Yeah.
I'm in favor of the Visegrad Union. I'm in favor of the Central European Defense Initiative. I'm particularly in favor of that because it brings together Austria, Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Croatia. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. Uh, the I do think that there's a certain level in which you're going to be pushed together because you're all facing external pressures.
Hmm.
And I think that a lot of you realize this, which is all to the good. And this brings us to Kaiser Karl, because I firmly believe, you know, he was an amazing character for a lot of reasons. Uh, One of them, and this is amazing, if you study his life in detail, you will realize that he was, in a sense, betrayed by each of his peoples, one way or the other. Um, just as he was betrayed by a lot of his advisors. But what was his answer to that? Was he bitter? No, not in the slightest. What is amazing about him was that he loved each of his peoples. And you can see it in his writing about them. He loved the Austrians, he loved the Magyars, he loved the Czechs, the Sudetendeutsch, he loved the Poles, he loved the Ruthenian Ukrainians, he loved the Croatians, he loved the Slovenes. He loved the Serbs, the Austrian Serbs. He loved the Romanians. I mean, he loved them despite everything, despite the humiliations they put him through. He still loved them. I mean, it's hard to kind of wrap your head around that. If you could put yourself in his place, dying on Madeira after not just trying to hold things together, but then coming back to Hungary twice, and both of those, the saddest was the second, really, because that failed, sadly, out of the misconception of a man who was very loyal to him, General Lehar, who was a wonderful man, a heroic figure, but was a stickler for form and felt that another individual should be commanding who was senior to him, and whom he was personally assured was loyal, except that he wasn't. And the emperor, and this goes back to Bonnie Prince Charlie and Darby, the emperor didn't trust the guy. But Lehar said, "Oh, no, your majesty, believe me, he's true blue, etc., etc." Well, yeah, except he wasn't. And of course, Lehar felt like awful because of it, but this goes back to Karl knowing when people who supposedly knew better. Well, they didn't. So, Karl, after all this horror, he ends up in Madeira. He's dying. And what are one of his last phrases on his deathbed? "I am suffering that my peoples might come back together." Now, that is amazing. That is simply unbelievable. Now, mind you, he said a lot of devout, pious things. Thy will, Jesus, thy will. He insisted on seeing the Blessed Sacrament received as long as he could. I mean, and that's all wonderful. I mean, the purely religious aspect of his life was incredible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the fact that after everything he'd been put through, he still loved his peoples enough to offer his life for their reunion. That was simply astonishing. And I would say, now mind you, I'm an outsider. The only connection I have to it is that my country helped put you in the position you're in now. Oh, sorry. Never
Well,
mind.
we're Catholics, so we
What I
forgive
meant,
you.
what I meant was, but, but seriously, those of us who venerate the memory of Emperor Karl and the work of Emperor Karl and his intercession must surely strive to accomplish that which he offered his life for. And I'm not speaking of necessarily any kind of revival of Austria-Hungary as it was, because that's not really possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But what is possible is a coming together of the peoples of Central Europe in some form, connected both with the faith and with the illustrious House of Habsburg. That's quite possible. The Hungarians, of course, we're just doing the 100th anniversary of Trianon. And, there are two things that do have to be realized. One is what a horrible trauma Trianon was.
Mm.
The other is what Magyarization really meant for the Hungarian minorities. That is to say, everybody has to try to see it through the other man's point of view.
Mm.
The other thing I think that really has to be done is that Tisza and Kossuth have to be separated from the Holy Crown.
But is it possible to look at all this and what let's say what us monarchists try to strive for from non-political point of view, or is it merely just what we can do in terms of politics and pragmatism? Like, is it suitable for us to be in Visegrad group or not? Okay, no, we're not going there. But
That
Yeah.
that is a pragmatic response. Visegrad, like the CEDI, are pragmatic responses that make perfect sense in a certain manner. The
Mm.
fact is, you've got much more in common with each other than you do with Western Europe or with Russia. There's no way around that. Now, how you express that practically, that's a whole other issue. And also, what you've got to be careful about. There's a phrase that's very big here and across the continent: European values. Now, the problem is that what is meant by European values in Central Europe, family, faith, freedom, and other things beginning with F, I guess. But uh, anyway, which are all perfectly decent. But that's not what the rulership of Western Europe means by European values. They mean degeneracy.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to accept this. You've got to understand that these are two different meanings. Now, mind you, I don't believe that all of Western Europe is as bad as its rulership by any stretch. In fact, I know of a certainty it's not. In Western Europe, you might say that every country is divided in two. The
Yeah,
real
obvious.
country, what's that?
Obviously, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
the real country and the legal country. But the legal country dominates. In Central Europe, however, it's the real country is not that divorced from the legal country, and certainly
Mhm.
not in places like Poland and Hungary and
Yeah.
all that.
I just wanted to say Poland, like.
Yeah, and as we just saw in Romania, the vote they just had there in Parliament, 300 to 3, that was great. On the education bill and all that.
I wasn't
So,
paying attention yet, but
well, you see, in a nutshell, there were all sorts of modern stuff they
okay,
wanted to push through, and it was smacked down 300 to 3.
perfect.
Yeah, and see, that's the thing. One has to look at the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Romanians, the Serbs. You got to bear in mind that everyone has their own story. Everyone
Mm-hmm.
has their own narrative. As a French Canadian American, I know this. I was brought up with 3 different versions of history. And I know one man's hero is another man's traitor. One man's victory is another man's atrocity. Well, you've got to understand that and get past it. And how do you do that? Well, you accept the fact that, maybe my side wasn't always right. Maybe their side wasn't always wrong. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
mean you've got to simply say, you've got to get on your knees and say, I'm so sorry for everything that ever happened. No, because history isn't like that. It's always messy. And at the end of the day, leaves no prisoners. There's not a single country that doesn't have blood on its hands, except maybe Liechtenstein. Uh, but the rest are made up of human beings, and human beings are very nasty creatures when they're allowed to be. So when I hate to quote Allen Ginsberg of all people, who was a bad poet and a bad man. Nevertheless, he had a phrase which I really love. Everyone's lies about everyone else are absolutely true. In other words, if I say that you're a worthless dog and you say that I'm filthy scum, probably you are a worthless dog and probably I am filthy scum. Fortunately, that's not all there is to the story. There's also the other side. But we have to understand this. And in truth, I do believe that God will answer Kaiser Karl's offer.
And
I
is
do
it?
believe
Yeah.
I
Sorry.
do
Yeah.
believe that the nations of Central Europe will come back together in some form. And I do believe I don't know for sure, of course, I can't tell the future. I don't have my tea leaves, no tarot cards in front of me, I don't have my gypsy next door, but I suspect that eventually Central Europe not only will come back together, but will be a tremendous catalyst for positive change in Europe and the Western world.
Now, two things I want to ask that came to my mind listening to what you were saying. Um, the horrors in the First World War, or for European people, they were, especially for the soldiers being there. It was something never seen before. And when you
Absolutely.
were talking about two sides lying about each other, making stuff up, it was like that. And
Yeah.
how can we um, compare how Kaiser Karl saw uh, on the whole situation? What was his point of view regarding all that stuff? Because I know he was very, very how do you say, pacifistic in some way.
Well, he was. You got to bear in mind that unlike most European leaders at the time, he'd actually been to the war.
Mm.
He was at the front at several of them. He was in Romania. He was in the Galician front. He was at Trentino. He was at the Serbian front. He was all over. And this, by the way, during the 2 years before he inherited the throne, his great uncle used him as a sort of roving observer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, he commanded in several spots, but to a great degree, he was his uncle's eyes and ears, his great uncle's eyes and ears. So he was keen on getting out of the war as quickly as possible, as honorably as possible, but as quickly as possible. Now, it so happened that his wife, Zita Bourbon Parma, had two brothers in the Belgian army,
Mm-hmm.
uh, Sixtus and Xavier of Bourbon Parma. And the Belgian king, the so-called King Knight Albert I, who also was on the front line with his troops, he gave them permission to act for their brother-in-law as emissaries. Now, mind you, he kept his mouth shut because all of these negotiations were hush hush.
Mm-hmm.
But the king of the Belgians, who was a very heroic figure in his own right,
Oh yeah.
uh, he he gave these two Bourbon Parma officers carte blanche to work for their brother-in-law toward a peace. And so they went back and forth between France and Austria via Switzerland.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and
During the war.
during the war, they carried on secret negotiations. Uh, but the problem that plagued Karl at every turn was that when the Allies were winning, or seemed to be winning at a given point, were not interested in peace. When the Germans were, when the Germans seemed to be winning, they were not interested in peace. So basically, whenever the one was interested in peace, it was because they thought they were losing, but the other wasn't interested. And what Karl wanted to do was simply get out of the war as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, and had he had his way, the war would have ended at least a year earlier. Now, what would that have meant? It would have meant millions still alive. It would have meant that Europe would have been in a better position when the Spanish flu came along, the great pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
was all the worse because of. Now, for that matter, in all likelihood, if Karl had been listened to, Russia would have turned out very differently.
Yeah,
He was
obviously.
he was dead set against sending Lenin to Russia. Number one. I mean, I've read his correspondence with the Germans. He said it's dishonorable. Number one, it'll
Did he
do.
suspect it?
Oh yeah,
Did
he knew.
did he
He
suspect it?
knew
Yeah.
absolutely. He told them if you let him loose in Russia, not only will it be bad for the Russians, but it will blow back on us. And so he couldn't stop the Germans from doing it. But what he did do was refuse to allow that sealed train to go over Austrian territory, which
Oh.
initially the Germans had planned to have it do. So he nixed that. But the only other ruler in Europe who was at all interested in peace in the way that he was the Pope, Benedict XV.
Yeah. That.
Now, Kaiser Wilhelm was personally interested in an early peace to a degree, but he was not. By that time, he was very much under the thumb of his generals. And also, and this is an important point to bear in mind, I said earlier that the Tsar and the Kaiser were not really in charge. by the time the war broke out. One of the ways you know this is that in 1902, Tsar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm went for a cruise in the Baltic, from Kiel. They were very close personally, incidentally. People don't realize that, but they were great friends. And they signed a treaty between them. And as soon as they each got back to Berlin and St. Petersburg, their governments nixed it. Now, how do their governments get away with doing that? And bear in mind, as far as Tsar Nicholas was concerned, this was before the quasi-democratic government of 1905. This is when he was supposed to have been the supreme autocrat of all the Russias.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, his ministers were able to overrule him. Mutatis mutandis, when the war came about, in the early days of the war, you read the correspondence of Wilhelm and Nicholas with their ministers and their generals. Same with Franz Josef, saying, "Well, I don't think this is a good idea. Maybe we better not." And they were, "Oh, we don't have a choice. We've got to do it. We've already called for a full mobilization. We have to do it."
Well, and it was the same with Kaiser Karl, because
Yes,
if I know that
until
he sent a treaty proposal to King George, if I'm
no.
correct. And
he sent one to the French. He also sent one to King George.
yeah, and Wilhelm, when Wilhelm found out, he said, "I'm going to attack Austria."
Yeah, he was yeah, and I mean the problem. See, at the end of the day, Karl had this problem. Peace would not be possible without some sort of internal alteration and reform in Austria-Hungary.
Mm-hmm.
But reform in Austria-Hungary was not possible without peace. So he was in a very bad position. And when he became emperor, Tisa, to a degree, tied his hands because he said, "Well, you can't really rule in Hungary unless you're crowned apostolic king."
Mm-hmm.
Well, in doing so, he had to swear allegiance to the constitution of Hungary as it was at the time, and to maintain Hungary's borders inviolate. That meant that there wasn't a lot he could do for the Croats and Slovaks and Romanians and so forth, because he took his oath very seriously. But it was interesting to see that while Tisa was quick to insist on his keeping the oath, he didn't keep his own oath to obeying his king very well, and used Hungarian grain as a blackmail device. So but it's not just Tisa. His foreign minister, Count Czernin, stabbed him in the back. There really was no Austrian politician that was really of sufficient weight to push his programs through. It was the Austrian system as it was in 1914 had a lot of problems. The last thing they needed was a war. Yeah. But of course, the same was true of every other country in Europe. And I've long thought that the two greatest tragedies predating the body of the war were, of course, Franz Ferdinand's murder, and before that, in 1913, the murder, and before that, the dismissal of the Russian Prime Minister Stolypin, who, as early as 1905, said that Russia needed 30 years of peace. And had he been Prime Minister in 1914, they wouldn't have gone to war. And that would have been the kibosh. Now, mind you, they might have found some other reason, because one thing you get a real feeling for is that, in some sense, the European nations were spoiling for war.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you look at the various things that went on before, the crises in the Balkans, in Morocco, this close every time. But every time it was successfully pushed off. Sadly, it wasn't in 1914. There's a fascinating movie It's not entirely correct historically, but it's still a fun film to watch, called The Wind and the Lion, about the American intervention in Morocco in 1904, which almost touched off the First World War then. And it was interesting because the United States were not really involved in Morocco. We were just blundering our way in, you know. And what happened was that the former American consul general in Tangier, a Greek named Eden Petikaris, was kidnapped by a Berber rebel against the Sultan. Well, the Sultan wouldn't do anything. The Bashar of Tangier wouldn't do anything. And President Roosevelt finally, he was so frustrated. He said, Petikaris alive, or Raizuli, that being the chieftain, or Raizuli dead. Well, nobody would do anything. So what he did was he occupied Tangier. Well, you see, this was a bolt from the blue. And the movie about it has this wonderful scene where the American Marines come off the ships, and they're literally running past the British, German, and French embassies on their way to the Bashar's palace. And they're all like, what? Because, you know, they were used to trying to outmaneuver each other, and they might go to war, you know, over Morocco. But to have the Americans come in out of nowhere for no seeming reason,
just ignoring them.
So they went in. They take the Bashar's palace, slaughter his guards, take him prisoner, and then told the Sultan, "Well, now you have a choice. You get us our man back, or you don't get your uncle back. Your call." And so the Sultan came up with a ransom, paid off the Raizuli. He got Petikaris back in one piece, and Petikaris goes back to the United States. But here's the funny addendum that you don't see in the movie, because in the movie they make Petikaris a woman. They get paid kind of fast and loose with the history. But he got back to D.C. and he goes in to see President Roosevelt. Now you got to understand that Roosevelt during this time was also grabbing the Panama Canal zone from Panama, from Colombia. So he was busy with a lot of things at that point. And he came up with this Petikaris alive or Raizuli dead slogan because an election was coming up, and he asserted that the United States will not tolerate the harming of a single American citizen overseas by any foreign nation, and so on and so on and so on. And of course, this whole falderall in Morocco was to prove that, and it did. Well, Petikaris goes into the White House to see President Roosevelt, and he says, you know, I really want to thank you for saving me and all that, although he and Raizuli had actually got on very well. They played chess and all that. But anyway, Roosevelt says, well, you know, this is what the United States would do for any of its citizens unjustly held captive overseas. He says, well, you know, it was kind of you to do so much for me, especially considering that I'm not a citizen.
And do we know the response?
No. I think it probably was some play on oops.
So what wine do you drink?
Yeah, oh, that's interesting. So, well, history is filled with these sorts of moments, you know. It's what we call in the States a Kodak moment. You know, you could have taken a film of it.
Yeah. Maybe.
But I mention this, though, because we Americans have always had a certain recklessness in dealing with things.
Oh, yeah, you know, cowboys.
In a certain sense. And, you know, sometimes it works in our favor, but very often it doesn't. And, you know, it's one thing when you've got a course of action that may be dishonest, but somehow always works for you. The British used to be like that, you know. That's why the French called them l'Albion perfide, perfidious Albion, because, I mean, yeah, they were underhanded, but they profited by it.
Yeah.
The problem with us is that we often do these things and we don't profit by them at all. In fact, the worse, it blows up in our faces, and we're kind of like, oh well.
But if we go back to Blessed Karl, Um, can we make a connection? Like, what was um, what was his life at the end of the World War and after the World War, and maybe some of his most prominent characteristic as a Catholic?
Well, I'll do the second question first because it determined a lot of the second.
Yeah.
To answer your question, he had a very, very rich devotional life.
Hmm.
He was a very fervent devotee of the Rosary, very Marian. When he and his wife were married, they took part of their honeymoon. They went to the great shrine of Maria Zell and you know pledged their marriage to the Magna Mater Austriae.
Can we mention the quote?
Yes, now we must
Of-
help each other get to heaven.
That's the perfect one. I mean,
And that
isn't it? Isn't it?
it is, yeah. Well, I mean, it's what every married couple should strive for.
If all the young newlyweds would contemplate on this quote for their first year of marriage, I think there would be no divorce.
Yeah, and and certainly the marriages would be very, very much happier.
Yeah,
I mean, if you look at your spouse not as a cross, but as an opportunity
of course.
to
Like,
grow in holiness,
okay, so I'll carry your whatever to heaven.
carry your water.
Yeah.
But so no, he was also very, very much a devotee of the Sacred Heart, and very much I mean, he did the consecration of the Sacred Heart and all that kind of thing. He was very, very, very devoted to the Blessed Sacrament and received much more frequently than people were used to doing in those days.
Hmm.
He loved the Mass, of course. Loved to go to shrines. Loved the holy days of the year, which he observed as well as he could. Remember too that the Habsburgs had their own sort of religiosity, which is called Pietas Austriaca, Austrian piety,
Yeah.
and it included very much devotion to the Passion of our Lord, to the Holy
Okay.
Cross, all this, and he was very much a part of all that.
Hmm.
The emperor would march to the Corpus Christi procession every year. Uh, he'd wash the feet of however many poor men as his birthday was.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, these sorts of ceremonies, by the way, were universal in Catholic Europe. All the different, well, most anyway, the kings of Spain and France and Bavaria, Naples and Sardinia and all that, uh, at least up until the mid 19th century, would do all these different things. But the Austrian emperors and the kings of Spain kept them up later than anybody else. Uh, on the Epiphany, they would present, I guess it would have been the Burgkapelle and the Hofburg with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Uh, it was a special ceremony for their blessing. It was all this kind of thing. Very devoted also to local shrines and local piety. Uh, and his wife was the same way. Now, Zita is very, very important for a number of reasons. They were very much a partnership,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
her background was interesting. Where he was certainly the epitome of the Habsburg in Central Europe, she was the epitome of all that was best in Catholic Western Europe. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, she was a Bourbon, and of
Hmm.
course, the Bourbons were the kings of Spain and France, France first, then Spain. The two Sicilies and the Duchy of Parma were her father, was the last reigning Duke of Parma.
Hmm.
Uh, Her mother was a Portuguese princess. Now, she was a descendant of the older line of the Portuguese Braganzas, who, like the Spanish Bourbon in the early 19th century, split in two. The older branch in both Spain and Portugal, older branch of the Braganzas, older branch of the Spanish Bourbon, were very Catholic, very traditional, not just in the sense of their religion, but in the sense of the governance of the country.
Hmm.
The younger lines of both families were more liberal, They wanted a monarchy kind of like the British or Louis Philippe in
Mm-hmm.
France.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhat anti-clerical. I mean, not again. These are all relative terms. To us today, the quote-unquote liberals would have been incredibly religious,
Oh,
but
okay.
we're going by their standards, not ours. It's just like if Martin Luther and Pope Leo X could have seen the French Revolution, they'd have been on the same side.
Yeah,
You know,
okay.
and if
You think
Abraham, yeah, I
you
think
think Martin Luther would be
look
on
at
the side of Catholics in
against the
French
revolutionaries.
in French Revolution?
Oh, sure, because you look what he did with the peasants in the peasant uprising in Germany. He had
Oh,
no
but it,
use.
it was pragmatic.
Well, of course, it was pragmatic, but the point I'm making is that people of a certain era, you may be revolutionary in your time,
Okay.
but you go and you look and see what happens. Trust me, you're going to feel very differently about it.
Oh, okay, I understand. Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean you're a good guy or a bad guy, but you look at the, I don't think so. You know, I mean, it's like today, I know many former hippie who looks at things today. And I mean, they may still be all for organic gardening and small communities, but
But well,
let's
that's
this
traditional Catholicism.
well, they didn't know it at the time. They thought it was, some
Or
new world order. But
gardening in small communities. That's it.
they didn't realize it was anything Catholic. But they may still be into all that, tie-dye jeans and long hair. But what hair there's left, of course. But uh, they may look at the transgender thing with like, what? Are you crazy? Because that's the way it is. If the Guelphs and the Ghibellines could have seen the Protestant revolt, they'd have been united.
Hmm.
What comes after is always far worse than what you thought, the horrible fight that you guys thought you had. I mean, we'll bring it down to something closer. If you could have assembled Tisa, uh, Masaryk, Benesch, and Kaiser Karl and shown them what was going to happen. You've got together or you've got the communists. Which is it going to be? Not even a question. Not even a question. Because in the light of what happens later, your own quarrels seem small. They're not at the time. At the
But
time,
did they not know anything about what's going on in Russia?
today,
No, I mean, Karl.
well, yes, they knew. He knew some. I mean, he knew. Well, as I say, he'd been very much against sending Lenin there. Number one. Number two, he was not happy about the Tsar being overthrown. Now, this seems counterintuitive because wasn't he fighting the Tsar? Well, yeah, but you got to remember that we are used to unconditional warfare. You fight your enemy until you destroy him, and then you reorganize his government and change everything. But they had the idea that you fought an enemy until them or you were defeated, and then you negotiated a peace that
Hmm.
was better or worse. Obviously, if you lost, it wasn't so good for you. But you didn't go out to try to remake or destroy the other country. Uh, I mean, Bismarck, I think if Napoleon III had not been overthrown, Bismarck would have made no attempt to get rid of him. Maybe he would have, because Bismarck was very modern, but who knows? Uh, but by and large, that was the way it was. So he wasn't happy with the overthrow of the Tsar because, of course, he saw in it the overthrow of all, of himself, of the Kaiser, of all the monarchies of Europe.
Hmm. Hmm.
But the Kaiser, and more particularly, and more importantly in this case, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, did not have that kind of vision. So he opposes sending Lenin in. Obviously, although he took advantage perforce of the situation when the communists took over and they eventually were able to force the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, um, which incidentally put him in a very peculiar position vis-a-vis the Ukrainians and the Poles. And that Boy, you think the Hungarians and their subject peoples had problems. The Polish-Ruthenian thing was a mess. If you please the one, you'd infuriate the other. Galicia was not the kind of I wouldn't want to be governor there, I'll tell you. But and now, Mr. Coulombe, a great gift. The emperor gives you the governorship of Galicia. Yeah.
I'm going to a monastery.
Yeah, I really appreciate your majesty. God bless you. God bless all in this house. Bye-bye. I include me out. But nevertheless, the sad truth of the matter is that he was willing to give up Galicia in return for peace. He was willing to do anything if it would end the war. But neither his allies nor his enemies were happy about it. So in any case, as far as Russia went, he was obviously horrified by the murder of the Tsar, which came about, of course, when Austria was on its last legs. Now, interestingly enough, however, when he withdrew from government on November the 11th, 1918, and left Schönbrunn for the hunting lodge at Eckartsau, things were very, very bad. Shipments of food from Vienna were being pilfered. There were Red Guards floating around the neighborhood. And Renner, the worthless Karl Renner, betrayed his country 3 times and died as president. I mean, if that isn't proof that virtue is its own reward, I don't know what is. But at any rate, Renner was making all sorts of nasty noises, and Karl was very fearful that they would end up like the Tsar. So what did he do? He wrote a letter to George V and asked for help.
Well, didn't teach him anything what happened to the Tsar when he wrote to George V?
It did. More importantly, it had taught George V.
Oh, yeah.
And so George V did something very unusual. He did something on his own and not on his government's say-so. And he sent an English colonel who was a Catholic and kind of an adventurer. I mean, I mean that literally. He was Colonel Strutt was his name, Edwin Strutt, and his life. I mean, it was like Lawrence of Arabia. You talk about a swashbuckler. He did all sorts of things. He was an amazing guy. So he goes to Eckartsau, and I think by this time the Allies, of course, had troops, small numbers of troops in various places in the old empire. So he picks up a company of like 6 military police, brings them up to Eckartsau, and immediately organizes the defense. Well, it becomes obvious that they're going to have to leave the country and go to Switzerland. So by this time, he's endeared himself to the imperial family. So he goes down into Vienna and he sees Renner. Well, goes into Renner's office. Renner's sitting there. And he says, "Get up. I'm the representative of the Entente. Stand over there." So Renner stands up, stands in the corner, and he sits at Renner's desk. He says, "Now, what can I do for you?" And Renner says, "Well, we want the emperor to leave or to abdicate. If he abdicates, he can stay. Otherwise, he has to leave." He says, "All right, he'll leave. And I insist on appointing, on having their possessions searched to make sure they're not stealing anything." He says, "You have my word as a British officer. There will be no theft. Only their own possessions will be taken." "Well, in that case, I demand that you allow me to appoint a high commissioner to, no, he doesn't say demand to allow. He says, "I'm going to send a high commissioner to oversee their departure." And Strutt pulled his pistol out, put it on the desk in front of him, and he said, "If you send such a person, I will shoot him." And that was the end of the interview. And he said, well, fine. So off Strutt goes. Well, in the meantime, Karl had made him promise that they would not leave like thieves in the night, but leave as the emperor. So he reassembled the imperial train. We went to the train yards in Vienna and got the whole thing put back together, engaged the crew to run it from the station by Eckartsau all the way through to Switzerland. So he gets everything loaded up. They're all set to go, and Renner calls him back into the office. So he has an inkling, because Strutt was one smart cookie. He has an inkling that Renner's going to try to pull something devious. So he prepared himself. And then he goes in to see Renner. And Renner says, unless the emperor abdicates his rights to the throne for himself and his descendants, we will not allow him to leave. We'll put him in prison. So Strutt says, well, all right. And he pulls out of his pocket a telegram note addressed to the Foreign Office in Whitehall. And it says, Austrian government refuses to permit imperial family to leave. Renew blockade. So Renner looks at it, and his face falls. So he goes, well, do whatever you want then. And so Strutt grabs the note and walks out. Well, of course, he had no standing to do that. They would never have done anything like that. I mean, it was a total bluff. But Renner was such a nasty little piece of work. People like that are always more fearful of their imaginations than they are of anything you can really do. Anyway, so that's what happened. They assembled the Imperial train. The Imperial train took them off into Switzerland. And Karl said, after 800 years, and then he said, I will be done, O Lord. And Zita turned to Strutt and said, Colonel Strutt, my family have been driven out of France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. And now I am driven out of Austria. To what country do I belong? And Strutt, of course, had no answer for that question. But then they got to Switzerland, and their adventures went on anew. The thing about Strutt was that he also helped them in their attempts to retake the Hungarian throne on his own recognizance. Although Charles had the tacit approval of Briand, who was running France at the time and had been the foreign minister and was quite aware of his attempts to make peace. Well, I mentioned Strutt in particular because many years later, Otto von Habsburg was interviewed and was asked, do you resent the British for the role they played in your family's misfortune? And Otto said, well, of course, it would be very easy to do so. But then there was Strutt. So it's a bright story in that time, and there were actually quite a few of these little grace notes. I told you about Borevich, but when they were at Schönbrunn still, before they were, sent off to Eckartsau, the Hungarian government had declared its independence, and Count Karl, who took over before Bela Kun became the head of the short-lived Soviet Republic, Karol ordered the Hungarian lifeguards back to Hungary. Off they marched, and Schönbrunn was left unguarded. For a good day, you could have just wandered off the street and taken anything you liked, or worse. But hearing this, the cadets from Wiener Neustadt and from the Artillery Academy in Teiskirchen, very close to where I am now, they marched off to Vienna, and they took up guard duty at Schönbrunn. And these were kids, 16 to 18. The funny thing was that Zita and her maids would take them sandwiches and things like this. And there was no way the emperor was going to let kids like that risk their lives. But you can imagine the feeling that they had from it. And of course, all sorts of people did their best to show their loyalty to them in their various misadventures. Give you a random example. You'll see these in the book, a number of them. There are so many of them, but one of them that comes to mind is that they were, when the second attempt at Hungary failed, they were put on a ship in the Danube, which took them down to the Black Sea, and they were transferred to another Royal Navy ship, and then taken to Madeira. But they noticed on this ship that the food was sort of familiar to them. It was very strange. It was very good. But I mean, it was as if every night exactly what they wanted, what they liked best, was prepared in precisely the way they liked it. It was very, very strange. It turned out that the chef on the ship had actually been an under chef at the Imperial Palace at the Hofburg, and I don't think they ever actually met the guy. But all that way, he kept them in precisely their favorite foods to the best visibility. And they absolutely charmed the crews of the ships that brought them into exile. So that when they finally arrived at Madeira, the crewmen said, we hope we'll be coming back soon to take you back to your homeland. I mean, this is the unfortunate thing. They charmed everyone they met. It's just that people they didn't meet had control of them. And the interesting thing, too, about their lives in Madeira, when they were in Switzerland, they had a bit of money. And that was, for instance, how, not a lot, but that was how the emperor was able to pay for Field Marshal Boreovich's tomb in the Zentraler Friedhof in Vienna. But in Madeira, not only had all their properties been seized by the successor governments, so they had no money coming in from that. None of their supporters were allowed to send them any money.
Okay.
And to make things worse, the Entente, still meeting in Paris, declared that they were not responsible for their upkeep, but the successor governments were. But the successor governments would not send any money. So they literally had nothing. And as a result, they had to move out of the hotel they had entered when they first arrived in Madeira, and they moved to this summer house that was given them to live in for free by its owner. But it was way up in the hills, and it was a summer house. And the hills of Madeira in the winter are foggy, and his lungs were bad, and that was how he contracted the pneumonia that killed him. There were no antibiotics in those days, and the treatments were horrible, cupping and all that kind of thing. It's just the hot cup put on your back to try to draw the infection out. It's just awful stuff. But he never lost his piety, never lost his faith. It's interesting that there had 8 children. Their youngest daughter was conceived in exile. And you see that too shows something of what they were like as a couple. Because despite the loss of everything, they still believed in God. They still believed in expanding the family and all that.
They were open to life and
precisely right.
Because most people nowadays would say, well, we can't afford sending kids to soccer, whatever, all trainings and
all this drivel. And with them, whenever I hear someone say, "Oh, how could you possibly bring someone how could you bring a new life into a world like this?" The way Karl and Zita did. That's how you do it. So when he was dying, she was pregnant with her unborn daughter, and it was a long and painful death. And he lay on his deathbed, as I say, and amongst the other things, he repeated, "I am suffering now that my people should come back together." He offered his death for them.
Is that something that we should look up to?
I'll say. Returning betrayal and mistreatment with love? Yeah, that's something we should look up to. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Being better than our opponents? Yeah. Because he knew that at the end of the day, the real victory is heaven. The only tragedy in your life is if you go to hell. That's it. Whatever else you go through, if it takes you to heaven, it's all to the good. whatever triumphs you think you have, whatever greatness you think you have, if it brings you to hell, it was worthless. But, interesting last point on his life, the day he died, he got very peculiar, as people often do on their deathbeds, and he said to his wife, "I have talked to the King of Spain. As soon as I'm buried, get in touch with him, and he'll take care of you." And she said, "What? How could you possibly have spoken to the King of Spain?" "Don't worry about it. Just do as I say." He died. They had the funeral. And after the funeral, she was able to get a call through to King Alfonso XIII, who sent a battleship to pick them up, to take them away from Madeira. And the Entente protested, and the British said that they would not let her leave unless she renounced the thrones, plural, for herself and her children. She refused, and Alfonso XIII told the British, "I am sending a ship to pick them up, and if you interfere with it or fire upon it, then you are at war with Spain." Well, remember that Lloyd George that very year backed down from getting into a fight with the Turks, who were in horrible shape. He was not going to get in a war with anybody for anything. So they backed down, and the Spanish ship sailed into Madeira Harbor, picked them up, and took them back to Spain. They arrive in Spain, they take the train to Madrid, and the Empress sits down with King Alfonso XIII. They're talking, they're comparing notes, and she says, "Why were you so keen on helping us out? We appreciate it, of course, but why were you so keen?" And he said, "Well, I'll tell you, it's a very strange thing. The day that they told me your husband was dying, I suddenly got a strange and very, very sharp and strong feeling that if I didn't take care of you, someday something similar would happen to my children and my wife. And that's why." And so she told him what he had said. And of course, they kind of looked at each other and rolled their eyes. So there were a lot of strange things like that in Emperor Karl's life, and you'll hear about them in the book. But they lived for the next 6 years in a Basque fishing village. And then in 1930, I guess, or 1929, knowing things were going to go south in Spain, they got the rent of a castle in Belgium. They moved there. And during the 30s, up until 38, it looked very, very much as though there might be a restoration. Dollfuss was in favor of it. But of course he was murdered. His successor was in favor of it, but not yet. Admiral Horthy, of course, had become regent of Hungary and had assured the emperor that he was in favor of restoration, but was not true to his word. Hence the two attempts to retake the throne, which Horthy managed to shoot down. But it looked good for a while. But then came the Anschluss, the rise of Hitler and all that. The Archduke Otto was actually in Berlin when Hitler and the Nazis took over. And he was there precisely because he wanted to see what the thing was all about. Hitler wanted to see him, and he managed to avoid seeing him. He said later that although normally he would have enjoyed such an interesting conversation, it was the one time in his life he couldn't bring himself to do it because he'd read Mein Kampf, and he knew what Hitler was about. Unlike a lot of other people, he knew what the story was. But as a result of all that, he did establish information networks in Germany and acquired a great deal of information about the Nazis, what they were doing, and so forth. One of his informants was Rudolf Graber, who later became the Bishop of Regensburg and wrote Athanasius in the Church of Today. But he was in touch with a lot of Catholic underground groups, and they kept Otto informed. He, in turn, turned over a lot of this information to the American ambassador in Paris, Mr. William Bullitt, who informed Franklin Roosevelt in Washington. Why is this important? Well, I'll tell you why. It's important because Otto was told by Roosevelt in return that if he ever needed a place to stay, he was welcome to come to the States. And in 1940, that eventuality occurred. The Germans invaded Belgium. King Leopold III called Empress Zita and said, "You better get out of Dodge because they are after you." And they were. They couldn't catch any Habsburgs, but they did catch the Hohenbergs, the children of Franz Ferdinand, and they threw them into concentration camps. They survived. Anyway, they escaped, and they had this crazy trip across a collapsing France just ahead of the Germans. And then there was a question, and I must say that as they escaped, they started out with a couple of carfuls of family and servants going through the French countryside. But as they would go along, there were a bunch of other Austrian refugees fleeing because, I mean, they would toast if the Germans caught them. And when they found out, oh my gosh, these are the Habsburgs, they attached themselves to them. So by the time they got to the Spanish border, they had about 200 Austrian refugees with them. Now, the border was supposed to be closed, and they really didn't know how they were going to get across, especially now with this mob. But it so happened that the chief of the border in that section had been the head of the police in a little town, a little boss town they'd lived in for 6 years, and he knew who they were. So he let them through, the whole bunch, the family and all the refugees. And oddly enough, and this is actually not important for the Habsburgs, but just an important historical note. I'm sure you've heard a lot of people say that Edward VIII, the British king who abdicated, was pro-Nazi and pro-German and all this stuff. I'm sure you've heard that. Well, this is where that kind of collapses, because at the same time the Habsburgs were escaping across France, so was the Duke of Windsor, Edward VIII, and his Duchess, because they were living in France when France fell. If they had wanted to collaborate with the Germans, all they had to do was sit tight in Paris. Instead, they too went on this wild, crazy flight across France. Now, he was pretty smart. He realized that he'd been very popular in the south of France, the Riviera, before the war. Well, he was Prince of Wales. He was very popular down there. So he and his wife made a beeline for the Riviera and were able to get through every checkpoint just by saying, "I'm the Prince of Wales." And they recognized him and let him through. And then he got to the Spanish border, was able to talk his way through, and then, like the Habsburgs, made his way to Lisbon. He, in turn, was picked up by a British ship and went to the Bahamas and has the whole of the story. But that exciting trip through collapsing France should be enough if one has a brain to dispel the idea that Edward VIII was a would-be Nazi collaborator. Now, of course, if you don't have a brain, you're probably running a university or you're a government minister somewhere. But anyway, not to be too unkind to morons. At any rate, well, no, one shouldn't be unkind to morons even when they are in charge, because it happens a lot. Anyway, so what should happen then? There they are in Lisbon. They go to the United States. And now, mind you, this story does have an end. I'm not going to go on to the present, but it is an important one to know, because it does tell you a lot about Zita. She had kept the brand going all through those years of exile. She saw to her son's education, her daughter's education. She kept in touch with monarchists in Austria and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Croatia and Slovenia. She kept the name, and in that respect, she reminds me of a modern person. Now, mind you, they're nothing alike in terms of personality or background or whatever. But believe it or not, she reminds me a bit of Gloria Tournontaxis. Simply because this was a lady who married the Prince von Tournontaxis and has devoted the rest of her life to keeping that princely house above water, even though she wasn't born to it. It was the same with Zita. She kept the Habsburg brand aloft, even though she wasn't born to it. And that's how devoted to Blessed Karl she was. I've often thought, that if we do for the centennial put together a golden roll of honor for all the various people that stayed loyal to Kaiser Karl, Zita's name really has to go at the very top. At any rate, they come to the United States. Otto goes to Washington, where he spends the war advising FDR on Austrian matters. And to be honest with you, the fact that there is an Austria at all today is very much due to his work with Roosevelt, because he was able to convince FDR that Austria was as much a victim as any other country. And that convinced him to keep Austria as an independent entity after the war rather than part of occupied Germany. I mean, it got occupied too, but it would have been a lot worse for them. Anyway, Zita and the rest of the kids went up to Quebec, where they lived for the rest of the war. And the younger brothers went to Laval University. Now, here's where it gets real fun. I mentioned Karl Renner before. Karl Renner was an interesting fellow. It was his greed, thirst for power, that led to the collapse of the Austrian parliament that forced Dollfuss to put in the Standesstaat. Because he was the Speaker of the House, and he resigned in order to be able to vote on a bill, and that paralyzed the House. When the Anschluss came along, Renner ordered the Socialist Party to vote for it. He attempted to collaborate with the Nazis. They weren't stupid. They could see what kind of a person he was, so they didn't use him, but they allowed him to live quite contentedly in Vienna all during the war. No camp, no nothing. This is the great Karl Renner, the great hero, after whom you'll see the Rennerplatz, the Rennerstrasse in almost every town in Austria. So, in the meantime, the youngest Habsburg princes, archdukes, graduate from Laval, and Otto sends them into the Tyrol, where they join the resistance. And they spend the last year of the war fighting the Nazis, risking their lives, unlike Karl Renner. Now, why is this important? Well, the Soviets invade, the war ends. The Tyrol is in the French zone. Otto goes there. They set up a sort of headquarters in Innsbruck. Renner is made chancellor by the Soviets prior to the election. And, well, he wrote Stalin a very obsequious letter. I mean, it was, I had to read the thing doing my research, and it was disgusting. I mean, you know, he didn't quite say, I lick your feet with love, but he might as well have. It was that bad. But it turned out he didn't have bothered, because Stalin knew exactly who he was and wanted to use him anyway. So it was, he wasted his time. He did, however, get that job. One of the first things he did was to invoke the anti-Habsburg law and have these princes who had fought for their country against the Nazis expelled while he was chancellor. Then they had an election. And very surprisingly, despite the presence of the Soviets, the Socialists lost. And so Renner was not chancellor. But Stalin insisted that he be made Bundespräsident. And so he died 5 years later as president of Austria. Fortunately for him, he didn't live to see the Soviets withdraw from Austria 5 years later. And when I deal with the man in my book, just so you don't lose track, the first time he betrays his country, I say, this is the first of the 3 times he betrayed his country. The second time, I say, this is the second of the 3 times he betrayed his country. And the third, of course, so this is the third of the 3 times he betrayed his country, just in case you didn't quite catch on. And what was kind of a strange thing for me, a few weeks ago, I mentioned you before the show that I was highly honored to lay that wreath at the tomb of Field Marshal Borevich in the Zentraler Friedhof.
Mm-hmm.
This is a man who gave his all for his emperor and who shared so many of his emperor's characteristics. I'm leaving that scene really kind of choked up. And as I'm leaving the Zentraler Friedhof, I see this big block of a tomb in the middle of the road. I'm thinking, I wonder who that could be. Very impressive. I go around to the front, I look, and there inscribed is Karl Renner. You know, I do not favor digging up the dead. I do not favor playing games with their bodies the way the communists did. But I think that perhaps an inscription should be added to that tomb. Thrice a traitor or something like that, to give a flavor for them. Usually when you see a tomb, it has something to do with the man's career. So I think that would be a fair thing to do. At any rate, I've belabored the point because after the war, Otto was left somehow in the face of the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe and most of his ancestral domains, and Karl Renner and company in Austria. He was left with trying to find a way to fulfill his father's vision. That was very difficult. And herein lies an interesting mistake that people often make. Just as they often try to separate the Emperor Karl's religious from his political message, which you can't really do, people tend to separate Otto's European efforts from his imperial efforts. And again, you can't really do that. What he had in mind was what a lot of people at that time had in mind. People like Robert Schumann and Alcide de Gasperi and Konrad Adenauer, which was the idea of transforming Europe into a sort of modern version of the Holy Empire. Hence the Karlspreis in Aachen and all this kind of stuff, which was a noble dream. Obviously, the EU did not turn out the way its founders anticipated, any more than the United States have turned out the way their founders anticipated. But when you'll often hear people say that Otto turned his back on the empire to work for Europe, it's not true. But you have to look at the thing like concentric rings, as it were. And you also have to bear in mind that he had to do what he could with what he had, which wasn't much. But he,
yeah, you know what I think? The torch is still well lit, and
yes,
we just, I mean, there are people that are more competent than myself, such as you, sir, and that could carry that torch maybe toward a brighter future regarding the reinstitution of Habsburg family to the throne they deserve.
well, one can only try. I mean, you can look at it this way if you like. And mind you, I speak as an American of French Canadian and various other descents. But Central Europe really is the heart of Europe in more ways than one. And again, when you say Europe, you've got to bear in mind that it's not just the space from Lisbon to the Ural Mountains. As the Archduke Otto himself wrote years ago, I'll never forget it. And mind you, this was during the communist era. He wrote, of course, in reality, Europe extends from San Francisco to Vladivostok. And then he said, although there are a lot of people who would rather see it extend from Vladivostok to San Francisco. But nevertheless, the health of Europe is bound up with the health of Central Europe. And the health of the Europe beyond the seas, the Americas, Australia, South Africa, and other places, is bound up with the health of old Europe. The continent is sick. Europe beyond the seas is sick. My country is sick. Well, it's a huge, huge problem. But there's an old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. If there is to be a restoration of Christendom, of Catholicity, it has to start somewhere. There has to be a place to stand. From what I can see, Central Europe is the best possible place. And to you has been given not just a heavy burden, but a heavy debt of honor. Because I repeat, Kaiser Karl loved dying all of you, all of his peoples. that is a debt that must be repaid. And I understand that the political classes in Austria and Hungary and Czechia and Slovakia and so on and so forth, not all of them, but big chunks of them, have a huge guilt complex in dealing with the Habsburgs. I know what they say. Oh, they were oppressed. It's a guilt complex. I get it. I understand it. I understand that when your whole ideology is committed to lionizing somebody like Karl Renner, adjusting to reality is a very hard thing to do and very painful because you have to admit you were wrong. I get that. Believe me, I'm a citizen of the country that put you in this place. I know what it's like having to wrestle with historical reality you don't particularly like. But it must be done. And you have enough here to help you do it in a way that we Americans simply don't have. This is extremely important, not just for yourselves, but for the rest of us. For the French, for the Spanish, the British, the Italians, the Dutch, and the Americans, the Canadians and Australians, the Peruvians and Mexicans and Brazilians. We're all in it together, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. And one of the silliest things in the world is to think that our differences from San Francisco to Vladivostok, great as they are more important than our similarities, because they aren't. What is our biggest similarity? Well, it is, one way or another, at some point, most of our ancestors anyway, claimed to be loyal to Christ the King and Mary the Queen. That was true in Russia. It was true in Bulgaria. It was true in France and Spain, and God knows it was true in Austria and Hungary and Slovenia and Czechia and so forth. That's a foundation that cannot be lost. And there are bits and pieces and remnants of it all over the West, but you have to look at them not as reminders of a glorious past, but the building blocks of a greater future. That's what I see when I see the Mariensäule in Prague. It's not a nice bow to the past. It is a sign of hope for the future. And this, I think, must and will come to pass if either the world doesn't end first, or we're to be completely overrun by drivel of any kind you want to name, whether it be radical Islam or multi-gendered perversity, or both together. God help us. I don't even want to think of what that would look like. But I'd pay a lot of money not to know. But pulling it all together, we have to remember, too, our grandfathers, in your case, great-grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers, died in the Great War. It's up to us to make sure that they didn't die for nothing. It's up to us to pull out the commonalities, the signs of unity. It's interesting that other than the King of the Belgians, the only other king to brave the front, like Emperor Karl did, was the King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III. That's why they called him the Soldier King, because he actually went to the front. Didn't have any control over anything, but he was there. And similarly, Edward VIII, that I mentioned, the Prince of Wales, well, why he wasn't pro-Nazi, but he was definitely anti-war. And how come? Because unlike so many people, like Lloyd George and so forth, he had been to the front. His chauffeur was killed right in front of him. See, these were the people who were actually risking their lives with their subjects, when the people making the real decisions were safe. The very famous story, and it's true, when Kaiser Karl, Emperor Zita, and this German admiral were discussing submarine warfare. And Karl said, it's a terrible thing. It'll bring in the Americans. And Emperor Zita pointed out that the blockade was absolute misery for the people. They're starving. And the admiral responded, well, I've always thought it worked better when I've tightened my belt and been on a tight regiment. And she looked at him and said, this is easy to say when you're sitting over a full table, which they were. Well, needless to say, she left the table shortly thereafter. But the point I'm making is that we have for too long, all of us, listened to the leaders that led from the back. Our fathers, to the largest extent, did not listen to the Kaiser Karls, or to the King Alberts, or to the Victor Emmanuels. We listened to siren voices that promised us everything, and not only did not deliver, they gave us far worse. And I say us because what did our Mr. Wilson give us? He gave us World War II. Even Churchill said that had it not been for the Americans and the modernizing influence, getting the Allies to push the Habsburgs and the Wittelsbachs and the Hohenzollerns off their thrones, Hitler would never have arisen, and we wouldn't have had the Second War. Churchill said that. Well, so we have to accept the fact that we were lied to, our fathers were lied to, and it's all drivel. What we need to do is redeem the time, because the time is evil. And to do so, we have to look at what was best in the past, pull it up, pull it out, and set it out for everyone to see. And then do likewise. And as for concrete political questions like Visegrad, like the CEDI, to the degree that we can, we need to Shanghai them. We need to make them work the right way for the right causes. Now, I don't mind saying that as an American, it's kind of frustrating, because I will always be on the sidelines here. Always. I'll always be the outsider. But I swear to you, anything I can do, I will do. My pen and my voice, so long as I've got them, so long as I'm able, I will keep beating the same drum.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. And I think those will be great words for ending our today talk. I won't add much, if any. I would just like to say that I think talks like this are much needed, because of the uncertain times that we live in, and I think realizing our commonalities, as you stated many times today, could avoid us to engage in any conflict as it was 100 years ago with the Great War.
Well, all I can say is, Kaiser Karl saw worse than we've seen so far.
Yeah.
And he came through it with his faith and his sense of humor intact. I can't emphasize the sense of humor enough. I've had a lot of names thrown at me in my career, but you know what a trad is in the States? It's a traditionalist.
Oh yeah.
So there are rad trads, who are of course radical traditionalists, bad trads, who are just nasty.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I shouldn't say it since it's me that it was thrown at, but I was called a glad trad, which made me very happy.
What's a glad trad?
If someone who's glad about being a traditionalist, it makes him happy.
Oh yeah, well, that's the worst.
Yeah, I know.
They see you being happy.
Well, I mean, to be happy, my gosh, it means something good's going on, and that is the other lesson to extract from Kaiser Karl. At the bottom of it all, despite the horrors and the pain, he was happy.
Never despair.
Never despair, ever. Because, no matter how bad it looks at an earthly level, there's always the hope of heaven.
Yeah.
And there's always the hope, too, that your efforts here may result in benefits you can't anticipate. I'll just say, as a last note on this particular point. About 15 years ago, I was having lunch with a French royalist politician in Paris, and he asked me if I saw any hope. Now, 15 years ago, in comparison to where we are now, the world seems like, in retrospect, it was wonderful. What was our problem? But at the time, it seemed pretty bleak. And I said, well, as a Catholic, I always have hope. But beyond that, let's pretend that you and I were St. Augustine and St. Ambrose discussing the state of the church and the empire. Well, in our time, St. Ambrose, it looks pretty bleak for the empire and the church. And in fact, it really looks pretty bad. The Visigoths are coming in, the Huns. I mean, gosh, what a mess. But as Catholics, we'd have hope. But you, St. Ambrose, and I, St. Augustine, couldn't possibly know about Clovis, the first king of the Franks, who would be baptized and crowned 60 years later. And that was the beginning of a greatness that we couldn't possibly have comprehended. And yet at the same time, if you, St. Ambrose, and me, St. Augustine, had not done what we did, there would have been no Clovis. You see, our efforts, they bore fruit, but a kind of fruit we could not possibly have predicted. All you can do is the best you can do with what you know. And God will take it, and God will make the increase, albeit in a way you may not have any comprehension of. I don't want to go on and on. We've got to end up, but I'll just say that I knew a fellow, and this is illustrative of what I'm trying to get across. I knew a fellow who was a Jewish guy. He was born Jewish in New York, and was in Japan as part of the Army of Occupation after World War II. Stayed on after the war. Brilliant man. Learned to read, write, and speak Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, and they're not related, just so you know. Their writing systems, although they look similar to us, they're not. But he was an incredible fellow, very, very bright. He read the writings of Father Matteo Ricci, S.J., in the original Chinese, written in the 1500s, and they converted him. Now think about that. An Italian Jesuit writing in Chinese in the 1500s converts in the 1900s a New York Jew. We don't know what will come from our efforts. And that is a lesson, if nothing else, Kaiser Karl's life should give us. The miracles that brought him to the altar took place in Brazil and now the United States, countries with which he had very little to do. And that tells you something about the universal appeal of Kaiser Karl. There are 14 shrines to him in the United States. He is the patron for our time. And I guarantee you, his example and his prayers will get us out of this mess and prepare us for the next one.
See, that's a Catholic humor. Sir, it was really, really, again, pleasure talking to you, to presenting all of us, Blessed Karl, in a probably for most of us very different lights that we used to know him. And I really do hope on getting hands on your new book, and we do hope that many of our listeners will read it, will buy it, and I'm looking forward to future discussions with you, sir.
Well, me too. And who knows, maybe we'll find a Slovene publisher.
Yeah, well, we first need to find a translator.
Well, there's that. There's that. And unfortunately, it's my English, so it's a little strange. But
Well,
anyway,
we're Slovenians. We're used to strange.
There's that. one of my best friends in Cleveland, Ohio, is of Slovenian descent. So she was thrilled
Ah,
when I told her I'd been on your show.
perfect, great, excellent. So, well, I wish you all the best in your future efforts regarding our common history.
Indeed.
And God bless you. Godspeed. And to all our listeners, I hope you had a good time listening to our talk. And God bless all of you as well. Sir, have a good night.
You too. God bless you and good night.